Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we share all things people stuff in leadership. Learn from leaders who have done the hard yards and learn from experience. Hear from expert authors about the latest insights from culture to strategy and messy people dynamics. Get tips and insights from multiple award-winning author and leadership expert herself, Zoe Routh. Now, on with the show.
Hi, it's Zoe. The question I have for you today is, how do other cultures develop leaders? That's our theme for this quarter, is developing other leaders. Do other countries do it differently? Well, we get some insider secrets from my guest today. Her name is Melanie Brock. She's the Global Ambassador at Japan at Advance. And let me tell you a little bit about her. She's pretty amazing. She was born in Albany, WA. She's a graduate of University of WA and has a master's degree from University of Queensland. She has been living and working in Japan for over 30 years, and she's had an extraordinary amount of interesting business experiences over there. At the moment, she's the chair emeritus, I think I pronounced that correctly, of the Australian-New Zealand Chamber of Commerce in Japan, having completed over 6 years as chair. Let me just list out a few of her interesting experiences over there. She's the founder of Nishigo Network, which is a nonprofit organization created to retain and expand the people-to-people links between Australia and Japan. She wants to build a social network of 1 million friends of Australia and Japan who will serve as the voice for the bilateral relationship. She is the CEO of her own consulting company. I mentioned the Australia-New Zealand Chamber of Commerce. She has been the chair of the Japanese chapter of the Australian Rugby Foundation, regional manager of Meat and Livestock Australia in Japan, and also worked at the Australian government. Probably that was one of her first roles moving into Australia. So she's got a huge wealth of experience in education, in agriculture, in commerce more broadly. And she is a bridge builder, as I've described her. And in this fabulous interview, and she has such a beautiful manner, we explore differences and similarities between cultures and how leadership is done in Japan. All right, let's get into it. Melanie, all the way from fabulous Japan, welcome to the show.
Good morning.
Well, I guess it is morning there. I love Japan. I've been to Japan 6, 7, 8 times, mostly for skiing, and fell in love with the scenery, with the skiing, with the culture and the people. So, and you've been living over there for 25 years, is that correct?
Yeah, nearly 30 now, actually. And it's interesting how the skiing has brought a new bunch of Japan fans. It's been lovely to see, particularly Australians, but New Zealanders and others coming to Australia from the Southern Hemisphere in summer and enjoying the winter. Of course, that's not possible this year, but we've had a lot of snow this year. So I'm sad to say you're missing out.
My husband checks the snow report and snow cams every day.
Oh, dear, you're real fans.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Anyway, that's our January, usually what we do. And now we're just kind of living vicariously through YouTube videos.
I can imagine. My son has some friends who are in Niseko, and I saw some of their videos yesterday, and they were just beautiful. The snow looked terrific. And, I think the communities are probably missing the support. Well, I know they will be missing the tourism, dollar, because it's certainly been something that's created a new industry for a lot of the people in the northern parts of Japan.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So as a fellow world traveler, so I was born in England, grew up in Canada, and have ended up in Australia. Your journey you're an Australian living in Japan now for 30 years. What was your first experience of Japan?
I was really clear as a sort of a teenager that I wanted to be part of the Rotary Youth Exchange Program, primarily because Dad and Mum were involved in the Rotary movement, and we sort of had lots of exchange students, in town in Albany, where I was born and grew up. And I sort of always had thought that I'd like to, experience that. The gap year wasn't it just wasn't a thing then. This is 1981. But I applied for the exchange program, and unbeknownst to me, I was selected and chosen to come to Japan. which was quite a shock because I'd put down things like, I actually put down West Germany, Denmark, I see, because I thought it was France, but it was Denmark, and Canada, French-speaking Canada, would you believe? Yeah, because I obviously wanted to learn a Romance language.
And then you ended up in Japan.
I know, yeah. So I'm very lucky for that.
What was your first impression of the country as a young person arriving there?
We arrived, it's actually 39 years ago this January, and so it was very cold. And I remember sort of everything being through that prism of how freezing it was. You know, you sort of wanted to go outside and then you realised that you just couldn't go out in just, you know, no socks in your shoe, you know, all that stuff that Australians aren't really used to. But I just remember everything being so incredibly different. Of course, I didn't speak any Japanese, so I had no idea what was going on. And I remember just chatting away. I'd had my wisdom teeth taken out about 10 days before I flew. And I remember trying to tell my Japanese host family that I'd had a major operation and been in hospital for 2 days and, you know, general anaesthetic. And now I look back on that after having studied Japanese, I can't imagine what they must have thought as well, because here I am trying to explain what wisdom teeth are in Japanese, and, you know, it's quite a different word. And anyway, I do remember everything being very different, and just so I became quite tired, you know, like the learning new words. I found myself always needing to have a little disco nap, which was funny for a 17-year-old, I think, you know. But yeah, it was very different, so different. The food, the language, the people, the culture, the look of it, everything. It was quite a shock, actually. I think I was very homesick for a while, but then I just got stuck into it and I loved it.
Obviously, you loved it since you're there.
Yeah, exactly. I know.
So that was the surprise and shock to the system. What was it about Japan that kept you there? Like, what did you fall in love with?
Well, I fell in love with a bloke first, and you know, as life has it, I fell out of love with him, although I'm still very good friends with him. But I think I loved the language the most. I found it really fascinating. I'd studied Italian and Indonesian at school, which is a bit random, but I don't suppose as a, you know, teenager in a very white community in the southwest of Western Australia in the 70s and early 80s that I'd even really envisaged what living in another country was truly. I knew about language and culture, but I probably didn't realise the impact that learning a language would have on you in terms of what you learnt about culture and people and yourself too, probably. So I think it was the language that it was such a challenge. And as I say, not knowing how to say anything meant that anything that you did say and that was understood was such a joy. And you thought you were a champion. Maybe it was the incremental learning, but I really loved that challenge.
That's fantastic. How did you end up living there? So this is your first experience, you went to Rotary, you found love with the language. Did you make a decision that you wanted to move there permanently, or did you go over there?
No, I went home as you do after the 12 months. And, you know, I think I suffered a lot of, you know, reverse culture shock, and I was still in love with the boy and I wanted to come back and blah, blah, blah. But I got stuck into university. I went to UWA and I changed my preferences and ended up doing a double major in history and in Japanese language, which I just loved. And then, you know, we were involved in the Japanese studies group and all of that. So it sort of changed my whole world from being, I don't know what I was going to do that would have been so interesting to me. I don't know what I was thinking, you know. It's a long time ago. I'm 56 now. I can't think about what I was thinking as a teenager. But I do remember loving Japanese, and so I thought that perhaps I'd want to be an interpreter or do something like that. And so I studied. I then got another scholarship from the West Australian government to come back and do more study, and then went back. And then I went on to do my master's in Queensland, actually, because it was one of the only places in Australia that would offer conference interpreting and translation at master's level. And I did that in 1989 and 90. And then I had my two boys in 91 and 92. And I guess at that stage, I didn't envisage living in Japan ever because, you know, I The boys, my parents are in Australia, my sister, my brother, my ex-husband was there with us, of course. And so I never really imagined not living in Australia, I guess, or not. I don't know what I was, but I do remember when the children were about 2 or 3, I was clear that I wanted the boys to be in Japan for a part of their early years, because I felt that the culture, Japanese culture, is quite a sort of a dominant culture. I don't mean that in any them and us or up and down type of view, but more that I felt that the boys needed to experience their Japanese-ness as young people so that they would always have that as adults. And I thought that that was what I should give them. So we trundled up here with 2 suitcases in 1995. So, and that's been it. Yeah. So it was a desire to give the boys access to their Japanese side and to let them feel that rather than having to learn it later, for example.
Was their father Japanese?
Yes, their dad is Japanese. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So and because he was staying in Australia,
right,
I thought that we had to give them both so that they wouldn't become sort of kids who later didn't understand their identity.
Right.
It's very important to me to deliver them that.
So you did the kid's dad go with you?
No, he stayed in Australia.
He stayed in Australia. You did the Japanese experience with them.
I did the Japanese bit. And so the boys were 3 and 4, and of course they spoke only English. And then we got here, and I'd sung Japanese, nursery rhymes and what have you to them as littlies. And, I tried to sort of, and their dad spoke to them in Japanese. But they were essentially English-speaking little people. And then they came to Japan and they learnt to speak Japanese as 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds. So their journey's been quite interesting too in terms of their language acquisition. Yeah.
What do you mean by Japan as a dominant culture? Do you mean strong culture? Is that what you meant by that?
I think what I mean, and I don't know that the word dominant is right, but I felt that a lot about Japan is based on belonging. It's on the group or association. And I felt that, I'd heard of students who'd lived a long time during their, early years and then come back to Japan as adults. And they indicated that they found it hard to get back into the group or to be seen as Japanese. And so I felt that sometimes, that perhaps with a more defined cultural, like Australia's got so many different cultures that make up who we are. And so I think in Australia you can be, Canadian, and you can be Canadian and Australian quite easily. Whereas I didn't know, I think that Japanese is quite a defined belonging, and I needed for my boys to have access to that as little people so they would understand what it meant, whether it was good or bad, just that they would feel it rather than they would have to learn it at TAFE later. I didn't want them ever having to go to Japanese cultural lessons to learn what it meant to be a Japanese person. I wanted them to experience it as babies, as little people.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense to me. So it sounds like Japanese culture is more like you need to adopt it and get absorbed into it. And the way that they used to describe Canadian versus American culture is similar in the way that you're describing Japan and Australia, is that Canadian culture is very much salad bowl. You can maintain your original place of origin culture as well as being a Canadian. And America was very much a melting pot. So you got subsumed into the dominant culture of Americanism. It sounds like the similar parallel.
Yeah, and language, of course, drives that in many ways. But the group and the culture and the belonging and the importance of the group versus individual is very different to, of course, Australia, which is all about individual. And, that's been evident throughout this year or last year with COVID, how a society deals with lockdowns without fines, for example, here, as opposed to Australia where you have to enforce those rules, etc. So that's all about individual versus group, I think, and probably a lot more. But yeah, I felt that would be something that I could give them. I do remember saying to my parents, I'd like to go and live in New York, London, or Tokyo. So as much as I had the idea of taking the children to learn more about Japan, I probably wanted a big city as well. That's probably got to be a bit of just me wanting to live in the big city. Because I don't know how I could have lived in New York. I don't know what I was thinking.
A huge contrast, like
Totally.
In cultures. And if you're going to do a spectrum of community versus individualism, you've got Japan, community-oriented social norms, and then you've got Australia in the middle, I think.
Do you? Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think so, because I haven't compared it to what's happening in Japan in terms of response to the pandemic and its restrictions. I've been thinking a lot about between Australia and North America, and I include Canada there because they're also a basket case when it comes to COVID. And the response to let's do this for the community, in the US, it's just so extreme individualism that people protest. It's my right not to wear a mask. And Japanese would be horrified with that.
Well, I went to the like a local packaging service place yesterday, and there's a perspex screen so that that the person behind the desk is protected, etc. And a guy before me, a Japanese man, had been in there in the room without a mask, and it's quite unusual. And I said to the young woman, I said, "How dare he come in like that?" And she said, "Oh, I didn't even see it." And I thought she's probably being kind, but and also she might be making a comment about the fact that I'm like the police here, saying, why didn't he have a mask on and the like. But I'm very conscious that in Japan at the moment, that's what we're doing, where everybody wears a mask. Some people question it. Some people understand that, it's just what you've got to get on with. But it's certainly unusual for Japanese, I think, to be seeing the connection that people make, the political statement that people make about it being a sort of suppressing their rights, their human rights, when enforced to wear a mask. I think it's probably I see it on the news. Everyone sort of goes, oh, goodness, this is taking place. So it's quite unusual for a Japanese person because they're used to wearing masks anyway.
Yeah, which I always found really fascinating visiting Japan and seeing people walking around wearing masks. I thought this is pre-pandemic. I remember thinking to myself, like, that just doesn't happen in Australia. Like, if you've got a cold, you just let your snot go everywhere.
Exactly. Occasionally you'll hear someone saying, cover your mouth. But and of course for Japanese, a lot of people suffer from hay fever. And so masks are pretty well developed and the like, But anyway, it's been very interesting looking at the way that countries have considered their responses, that's for sure.
I'm curious about your experience and or understanding of the Japanese approach to leadership and how that might differ, if it does, from Australian leadership.
In just the pandemic or in more generally?
More generally, yeah.
The decision-making processes are quite different, and how a leader provides information to either the company employees or, in the case of political leaders, to the general public, etc., is very different to how we do it in Australia, from what I can tell, mostly because it's driven by consensus. The process here is fairly much, from the various examples that I've experienced living here, is that Japanese tend to want to have a consensus-based approach such that if there are any issues, they've already ticked off or they've dealt with some of the major concerns that people might have, and that the passage of, say, for example, the piece of legislation will be smooth, or the implementation of a new practice or a new method or a new style or something. It's sort of like the smooth part is the implementation. The tricky bit sometimes is the big discussion. Sometimes I think Australian leaders throw issues at the media and have it like regurgitated or, dealt with and belted around a little bit. And then they say, right, now we've indicated or we've seen your great displeasure for this, we'll tone that bit down and then we move forward. So I think sometimes it's in Japan, takes longer to get something happening at the beginning, and then the implementation of that is driven by the fact that you have everybody on board. Whereas in Australia, I think sometimes there's less consideration for getting everybody on board, and then the issue might be pushed forward, and then you hope to do the work, to do the issues management. So that drives a lot of different leadership models too. It means that people spend a lot of time ticking off like issues, having the chat, making sure that this group's calm about that or not too fussed about that. So I think there's a lot of pre-discussion that takes place, and that can sometimes be seen to be evidence of clunkiness or indecisiveness, but I think it's just part of the process. There have definitely been examples where it is indecisive, though. There's no doubt about that, but it's not always just because of that.
It sounds like it's very consultative.
Yeah, it is actually. Yeah, although there's a bell curve, I think, that you see applied, and I'm not so sure that the mad, rabid, crazy, 5% at one end of the bell curve and the 5% at the other get listened to very often. It's all about the good of the general public. So, 80% covered is probably what people consider as being okay. But I think it's very consultative, but it's very slow as a result. So that draws criticism from a lot of people.
I'm also interested in how the Japanese people approach developing people. Is this left up to the leader to help develop their team, the individuals on their team? So the theme for this podcast for this quarter is developing other leaders. And I'm wondering if there is an approach to that in Japan. Are you left to your own devices in terms of working your way up the ranks in meritocracy? Is there a stewardship, a mentorship of some kind? How does that sort of sit within the culture?
As you're asking that, I'm sort of questioning myself how that might happen. I think, once again, the importance of the group probably drives a lot of that. When people are at university, they could be learning, archaeology, and then they go and work in a trading company, knowing that when they get into the trading company, for example, the first few years are very formative in terms of senior people teaching all their division leaders, etc., their bosses, teaching them a little bit about how the company expects them to behave. So there's a lot of development of talent, not of talent, but of processes and approach potentially there. And it's well understood and a given that people know that they will be they can do what they like at university, but when they get into a company, the company will then drive a lot of the change that takes place in them as employees. Yeah, it's a big part of that company's commitment to a particular person, that when they take them on, they're there for a long period of time. So they see that first year and 2 years as being formative. Whereas we would take people, I think, and expect them to perform at a higher level early on. But we also know that there's more mobility in our labour force. Until very recently, it was a sign of respect that, somebody works at a company for 37 years or, 42 years or, 16 years and the like. Well, you don't hear that as often in Australia as you do here.
Is that still the norm in Japan, that people stay for a longer period of time in one workplace?
A lot of people will say that it's completely changed. I don't think it has, but I do see areas of change, where people are. And COVID has been a big factor in that. A lot of people have said, okay, well, now I see that, this company's been very supportive of my family's needs during this time. Right, I'm going to stick with them. Or no, I'm going to look for different opportunities because I don't think their response has been particularly supportive of the community, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that there'll be great change for Japan. But of course, that's what underpinned all of the economic growth, this commitment to the company, because a commitment to the company was a commitment to the country. So those long-term commitments that people made, both by the company to the people and from the people to the company, they're sort of the backbone of Japan, really. But young people aren't really signing up for it, or rather they are signing up for it because they want to go and work at those places, but they want to have mobility.
Question just to clarify around that. So the idea of committing to a company is commitment to the country.
That was, I think, the old adage.
That's the old way. Okay. It's not so true nowadays.
No, I think now there are a lot of people, in particular in the last 12 months, a lot of young people would be saying their commitment is to their family and that the company that they work for, they hope would support their having more engagement with their families, for example, than what has been the case for some of their fathers or their uncles and the like, particularly young men wanting to be more involved with their family's upbringing, spending more time with their kids, etc. So I think there's probably a huge societal shift taking place. And therefore, that whole issue of mentoring and development and talent development will become potentially more interesting, but more fractured too, as the companies need to look at, we might put 2 years into an employee, but they're going to move in 5 years. Well, that's a different type of approach that they're going to have to take. But on the issue of mentoring, I think a lot of it happens in that small division in the company. There's probably, Japanese have a great sort of system called senpai and kohai. Senpai is sort of like a senior or somebody who's been in the organisation or in the group or in the sporting club or something before you. So I started university in UWA in 1983. Anybody who comes in after, therefore, becomes my kohai, and I'm their senpai. And in Japan, there's a lovely sort of expectation that the senpai will support the kohai. So there's probably a natural mentoring that takes place that isn't physically called mentoring. It's just that whole system, which is quite lovely, I think. It also has its downside where it creates a lot of pressure for people who are in either of those groups that don't want to be in them, of course, or are bound to a group because they joined the company, a year later, or, they're part of an association and their term is only 4 years and somebody else is 5, and therefore they make all the decisions. So there's that sort of power balance that I think plays out sometimes. But, there has been a lot of discussion of late about how women in particular can be mentored and how, who does that mentoring and how they get access to that. And it's an area I hope will flourish such that young women see the opportunities for them in business as well, particularly when they've made the decision to go back to work after having kids. It would be nice to think that the mentor network, if it was established well enough, it would allow them to flow back in better, wouldn't it? It would be, yeah.
Is this something that's in public discourse in Japan?
A little bit, a lot more than it has been. There are some fantastic examples of leadership, I think, demonstrated in Japan. Companies like Shiseido, the cosmetics company, Calbee, which is a confectionery company. These are companies that are well known in Japan for being mindful, for being supportive, for being committed to gender equality and to training, I think. And so I think that the fact that that is discussed and, it means that other companies aspire to be like them in many ways. I think the other thing that's quite different here now compared to Australia is the discussion around the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. In Japan, SDGs are referred to often now. And of course, I can't remember the actual goal, which one it is that refers to training, but of course it's probably bound up in a couple of those. But there is a lot of discussion about how the SDGs will support talent. And I think that's a great conversation for Japanese businesses to be having. Yeah.
Oh, it should be a great conversation for Australian businesses to be having, I reckon.
I agree. And I think for Japan, having a sort of clearly defined and understood sort of set of goals, and there's a lot of discussion about what they mean, what the goals look like, what could they mean for small business, what could they mean for big business, what do they mean for local government, associations and the like. Having that discussion has really helped people, I think, then say, okay, well, this is something that we could adopt or we could adapt to our circumstances, and sort of it's defined. So it's really, I think it would be great for Australia to know more about the SDGs. I think, yeah, it would help people.
It does, and it should. It does for some of my clients who are definitely incorporated some of the SDGs into their strategic objectives, which is really nice. I wouldn't say that it's prevalent and across the broader country. I want to change tack a little bit and ask you a little bit about your experience and philosophy of leadership. Having a look at your amazing resume on LinkedIn. You've been in a number of different organizations and a number of different roles. I'd describe some of your roles, or many of them, as being a bridge builder, like bridging countries, So you, say, for example, are the chair of the Japanese chapter of Australian rugby. Which I thought that was amazing. You've been the regional manager of Meat and Livestock Australia in Japan. And you're also are you the chair of the Japanese Australian Chamber of Commerce?
I'm the chair emeritus, which means that I'm the old lady of the old soldier of the organisation. I was chair for 6-ish years and stepped down about 4 years ago, and now I'm still the chair emeritus. But yeah, the bridge building is a lovely expression, so thank you for that. The Japanese also use that expression.
Do they?
Yeah, when they describe somebody who works between two cultures or two countries. So it's probably quite appropriate. It brings with it some tricky navigation, I guess, when things go wonky, like sometimes when you've got to pull up somebody for something they might be doing in one culture that's creating angst in the other. And when egos are involved, you've got to be very carefully managing that minefield. And the other thing that I realised, being the so-called bridge builder, is that what I see as being entirely natural sometimes isn't in fact the case. And so sometimes you just have to take that very simply, and you have to explain things and talk about the impact that it'll have if you changed a little thing. So I remember saying to somebody once that I felt that it came down to etiquette, that, if you follow just general principles of etiquette and manners, you'd be fine. And they're Australian, and they pulled me up and they said it's not that at all. That is a big part of it, but that sometimes the advice about, say, for example, if you're going into a business meeting where the primary person sits such that they are considered to, they're well known to be the main person who will be speaking on a particular matter or not, who goes into the room first, or who speaks first, or how long you speak for, all those things aren't just manners. And so those simple things have been indicated to me as being really important chunks of the bridge building.
Well, those are status and power signals, which are different in different cultures.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, knowing them and, and things like, what type of a gift do people prepare? And I mean, they sound all very 101 business sort of, management stuff, but they are fairly important in getting the right tone. And if anything, it's about tone, isn't it?
Yeah, I think about that too. I wonder if, going to visit, say, for example, our ski fields, and we stay at the same place every time, bringing a gift to our hosts.
Yeah.
What's an appropriate gift?
I know. Well, but you're doing that potentially. And also people do that because they're just nice. I think that's why I say manners and etiquette, because most of us are just good, decent people, I think, wanting to do the right thing. I guess my point before was that I sometimes didn't think that people needed to get too wound up about what was right in Japanese culture, because they should just do what they would do in their own culture. But it was pointed out to me that there are those status and power signals that you have to be mindful of, and that it will help you drive the discussions. And I think that's very true. So I've stopped saying that. I've been picked up.
Okay.
I learned a lot.
So the roles that you've taken are pretty significant leadership roles in terms of being a steward between two cultures. Do you have a philosophy of leadership that's helped you navigate some of that?
Well, I'm quite sure that some of the people who I've led would say that I don't have a philosophy. I don't know. Obviously I think that community is very important to me. And so understanding your community and understanding the needs of your community and how that fits into somebody else's is really important. Obviously respect. I think the Japanese language, with its respect language, has taught me probably more about that than anything, which has been really interesting. Learning about how Japanese demonstrate respect to their elders and people who have been in the business and what have you longer than they have. So that's been an important part of my own process, I think. But I also like to think that I've stayed flat and true to my sort of Australian, raised in a small country town type of approach, in that I think some people in biggish roles can get swept up in the moment, but I'd like to think that I'm actually probably fairly much the same person I was, and that I bring an Australian boots and all, get on with it, muck in and get stuff done type of approach to my leadership as well. I've never wanted anybody to say that I was, frightened of, I think I've got a strong work ethic too. So that's part of my approach. Yeah.
Is there anything that you miss about Australia? This is my last question, really.
Like now or just in general?
In general.
Yeah, I'd fly home probably, for work and stuff, probably once a month in the last 4 or 5 years.
Oh, wow.
And so I never felt like I was missing anything because I had access to it. I'd see that great exchange between a coffee shop person and a business person, and I'd think, oh, I love this egalitarian approach and or I'd hear different languages being spoken and I'd think, oh, I love Australia for that. Or you could go down and have fish and chips and just sit out on a picnic, but that casual sort of informal part of Australia. I had access to it because I was flying home, but now I really am yearning for that because it's been a year. Obviously, I want to see mum and dad and my son and family and friends, but it's that sort of informal, casual, relaxed stuff, maybe walking down to the beach with no shoes on, those type of things. That's what I really probably miss at the moment. Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see, when I finally do get to Australia, what I do first, what part of what I thought I was missing did I miss, That's, yeah. It's just that casual, informal nature of Australia I think I miss.
That's a really interesting observation of Australia. What have your children ended up doing? Have they stayed in Japan? Have they come back to Australia? Have they gone elsewhere?
Interestingly, one is there and one is here.
Right.
And so if anybody's the bridge builder, it's me still, between the two of them really, because one's probably, my younger son is probably more Australian in his approach, and my older son is married to a Japanese young lass, and she is just magnificent. She's the absolute best daughter-in-law and the mother of my Tokyo-based grandchildren. And she is, and probably because of him being in Japan, and he's much more Japanese-ish at the moment, if that makes any sense. But
sure,
I'd like to think that having given them both, that they've been able to pick and choose a little bit about which one they have. So I don't know. I always wish that we'd studied their acquisition of language, because I think it would have been an interesting study. But anyway, well past that now. They're nearly in their 30s.
Fantastic. Well, I wanted to say thank you so much, Melanie, for sharing your story and your insights about being a bridge builder and, standing between two cultures and helping people understand each other better. It's a really important role in community and communities around the globe, and we need more people to do that and to share insight and love of the best parts of each culture. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, Melanie has such a beautiful manner. I just loved having this conversation with her about the differences and similarities between Australia and Japan when it comes to leadership and life more broadly. A couple of things stick out for me. One is this whole idea of how we treat our elders, how we respect our elders, and how Japan does this so much better than we do in a lot of Western countries, including Australia and Canada. And this whole idea of senpai, the senior, and kohai, the junior, and the relationship between the two, I think is a really interesting one, that there's opportunities if we borrow some key insights from Japan we can make use of here in our own businesses and leadership. I love that sort of relationship where we support the elder and the elder brings up and nurtures the younger. I think that's great. And I love her insight about the casualness of Australian culture. And it's something that we probably take for granted. It's like fish don't know they swim in water. It is a fairly casual, relaxed culture. And it's only by going to other countries that we start to appreciate and actually notice the nuances of a culture. So what I extract from that is the ability to look with new eyes at the water we're swimming in. And what can we glean from that? What can we appreciate about the culture that we're in, whether it's our business culture or our national culture or our community culture? How might we look with new eyes and appreciation about the good things and the bad things in what we're experiencing, and to elevate the things that are useful and to be mindful of the things that are not so useful? Well, I hope you enjoyed this particular interview. It's a different approach, and it's nice to see a leader leading in a different context between two worlds, in a sense, and trying to build common ground and collaboration across countries. So we need more of that, for sure. If you like this episode, please rate and review the podcast. It really helps us get out the message and expose more people to these wonderful interviewees that we have on the show. In the meantime, live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast with leadership expert Zoe Routh. For more about people stuff and to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.